Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, freelance editor. This week I'm going to be talking about story structure, and today I'm going to start with the first plot point. So the first plot point is the first major plot point or turning point in your story. It occurs around the 20 to 25% mark. To understand what needs to happen at the first plot point, it's easiest to sort of conceptualize it as a point of no return. It's the point that the character gets to where they can no longer back out of the central conflict and they're sort of forced to move forward. At that point, they can't just go back to the status quo and sort of pretend like the beginning events of the story never happened. In other words, you can kind of think of it as if the character becomes locked into the central conflict. The key to making the first plot point work is in the stakes. No matter how much your character is locked into a conflict or locked into a situation, if they don't care about the outcome, then the reader isn't going to care either. It's really important that the outcome of the situation or the threat of the situation be something that the character feels very strongly about. Ideally, it should be something that the character believes that they can't live without. Even if the character might be overly or unnecessarily invested in the outcome or in the result, the character still needs to feel like this is something that they just can't live without. To clarify what the first plot point might look like, I'm going to go over 4 common types of first plot points to hopefully give you a better idea of how it might play out in your own novel. So these are the 4 common first plot points I'm going to go over. This is by no means an exhaustive list of first plot points. These are just some examples that I think will really help to get you a good sense of what you might want to do with your first plot point. So the first is the character becomes trapped. The second is the character becomes obligated to do something. The third is the character receives an ultimatum. And the fourth is the character is being pursued. And I'm going to go over these 4 types in depth in terms of how they might play out in a novel. So the first type that I want to cover is the character becomes physically trapped. If the character becomes trapped, then they're unable to return to the status quo or their old way of life. So in that way, they become almost forced to get involved in the conflict, regardless of whether they would choose to or not. To be trapped could mean that the character is willingly somewhere. For example, a child could be trapped at a boarding school because the parent dropped them off and now they can't leave, so they're sort of locked in at the boarding school. It could also be completely by force, such as a kidnapping or an abduction of some kind, or being held by a group. It could also be a natural disaster or an accident. There could be a cave-in, there could be a tornado. There are lots of ways the character could become trapped. The interesting thing about the first plot point is that it doesn't actually have to be the moment that the character becomes locked into the conflict. It just has to be the moment when the character realizes that they're locked into the conflict. So the first plot point, for example, could be when the character goes to the exit of the cave and sees that there's a cave in and sees that there's no way to get out. That doesn't mean that the character hasn't been trapped from the beginning. The character could have been trapped in the cave the entire time, the entire first quarter of the novel, but didn't realize it until the first plot point. The second common type of first plot point is when the character becomes obligated to do something. And this can take a lot of different forms. It could be a person realizes that they have a child that they didn't know they had. All of a sudden they become responsible for that child, and now they have this new obligation that they didn't have before, and that changes the status quo. And they can't get rid of that obligation or easily shirk the responsibility. So in that way they become forced into a new situation and they get pushed away from their ordinary life. And an obligation could also be a lot less severe depending on the type of person. So if you have a child and you're writing a middle grade, a mother forcing the child to get a job or forcing the child to babysit or act in a play could be an obligation that they have to fulfill. The key to writing an obligation that works well as the first plot point is that the character needs to have some reason why this obligation is difficult for them or some reason why it creates conflict, because if the character, for example, wants to do something and then gets that thing and then it works out as planned, it doesn't really work well because you don't really have a lot of room for conflict. It's possible to write an obligation where the character wanted to do something and then they obtain it or they become obligated in some way to do it, and then realize this isn't what I expected, this isn't what I wanted, this is totally different and horrible. So that's another way you could go about the obligation if you want the character to have been pursuing it purposefully. The third common type of first plot point is the ultimatum. And an ultimatum can come from pretty much any source that has power in the life of the character. So it could be a romantic partner, it could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be an employer, it could be almost anyone who has any leverage or any emotional power or literal power over the protagonist. So you might have a situation which would be very common, especially in a thriller, where somebody says, if you don't do this, then this horrible thing is going to happen. If you don't do what I want, then you're going to pay for it in some way. And this can be as dramatic as you bring me $1 million or I'm going to kill your wife, or it could be as simple as bring up your grades in school or you're going to lose your football scholarship. There's a lot of different types of ultimatums, but they can work very well because they're a very literal first plot point. The character has a very clear objective at that point for what they're supposed to do. If you don't do this, then this bad thing happens, and it makes it very easy for the reader to then connect with what the character has to do and what they'll lose if they don't do it. The last type of first plot point that I'm going to go over is when the character becomes pursued. And this can happen for a variety of reasons, just like all of these plot points. There's a lot of different ways that you can execute them in the novel. So a character could be a criminal, they committed a crime, and now they're being pursued by the police. Alternatively, the character could have witnessed a crime, and now they're being pursued by the bad guys. You could even have something supernatural where the character bought a possessed painting, and now they're being pursued by a ghost. The key is not so much that the character be pursued for the first time at the first plot point. The character just needs to realize either that they're being pursued, so previously there may have been clues, but they didn't really know what was going on, or they didn't really know who or what was pursuing them, or they need to realize for the first time what the risk is in being pursued, so they might realize for the first time what the threat is if they are caught. So to recap, the first plot point can be considered the point of no return. The character cannot go back to the status quo. In other words, the character can't return to what their life was like before the first plot point. And lastly, the character has something at stake. The character could have had something at stake throughout the story, but now the stakes have been intensified or clarified. So hopefully this video gave you a better idea of what could happen at your first plot point and how to craft a first plot point that really works well with the structure of your novel. Tomorrow I'm going to be moving on to the next major plot point, the midpoint.